Introduction to Insolvency, Understanding the Basics. Welcome to our first episode of IO Insolvency Options with Darren Vardy, the Managing Director of Insolvency Options and a registered liquidator with over 30 years of experience helping businesses and individuals navigate financial challenges. In today's episode, Darren shares his journey into insolvency, explains what insolvency actually means, and reveals the warning signs every business owner needs to recognize. We'll explore when to seek help and the difference between corporate and personal insolvency. You'll understand the fundamentals of insolvency, know when to seek professional advice, and learn why acting early gives you the most options. I'm your co-host Anthony Pearl. Let's dive into unlocking more about insolvency options. Darren, I guess what we should look at is, in terms of liquidation, what are the alternatives? Because that's where you want to be, right? You want to be looking at the alternatives before you get to that situation.
Correct. And, there are two main alternatives to liquidation. The first alternative is a relatively new regime called a small business restructure. The small business restructure is where an insolvency practitioner is appointed for the purposes of developing a plan of repayment to its creditors. And that plan of repayment is based on the affordability of the business to be able to continue to trade profitably into the future, or it may well come from a further injection of funds by the business owners to discharge some debt, restructure that debt position to then put them into a profitable position going forward. Now, that being said, there are some eligibility criteria that needs to be met. But at the end of the day, it's all about providing a better return to creditors than what creditors would ordinarily get in a liquidation scenario.
How easy is that to achieve, that to satisfy the creditors that you're going to be in a better situation by doing this?
What it comes down to is, as the insolvency practitioner putting the plan forward, we would do an investigation into the company's affairs, not dissimilar to what we would do in a liquidation scenario, to then determine what return would, in fact, be available in a liquidation scenario. And then based on that, we would then look at the affordability of the business to make an offer to its creditors to provide the best return possible, and then compare the two. And if the return that is affordable to the business is greater than a return in a liquidation, then the plan would be submitted and put forward by the insolvency practitioner, and who would then recommend the plan.
Commonly, when people think of the term restructure, they usually think about shifting departments around, shifting personnel around. Is that much of a factor when it comes to this area, or is it doesn't really come down to people as much?
It can come down to people, absolutely. However, what we find is, it is a small business restructure. We are dealing with small businesses who don't necessarily have the size and structure of what you're referring to. Really, it's about, in my view, from what we've seen, the reorganisation of debt and getting the working capital right for the business moving forward. There are some circumstances where I have seen that there was a pivot in the type of business. And as a result of the pivot in the type of business, there has been a change of staff within the business. That will then lead to profitability. Or there may be a change of product, or there might be a whole product range that's been dropped because of the low margin, which then results in, because of those sales not being there, it may result in some retrenchments being required. However, every business is different, and every business needs to be looked at on their merits.
Is there merit then in the concept of bringing someone new into the business? It could be in an advisory capacity. The problem being, of course, that you're talking about spending money when at the very point when you don't have money. But can new people coming in be a critical factor in determining the success, or is it too far gone at that point to really consider that properly?
Yes, they can, and all that will be assessed as part of the affordability of the plan going forward and the profitability of the business going forward.
And it's interesting, isn't it? With a lot of small businesses, they revolve around a person or two, and the success of that business hinges so completely on those people that whether you find yourself in a situation where you might be looking at a restructure or liquidation, or even if you wanted to sell the business, and it was going okay and you wanted to sell the business, being revolving around one or two people that are so intrinsic to the success of a business can make that incredibly difficult, I would imagine.
Yes, it can make it difficult. And yes, it's a big risk for business, and we all talk about the bus analogy. What happens if you only get hit by a bus tomorrow? Then what? And this is where you get into your risk management and having a risk management strategy in respect of the likes of that. But what we quite often find is that when a business owner is knocking on our door to have a chat about the adverse financial position their company is in, quite often we find that those business owners have in fact been a roadblock to the business in the past. And therefore, given the financial position it's in, we find that the business owner is actually quite receptive to plans being put in place to return the business to profitability and to move it forward, because that then allows them, to continue to operate the business, earn a living, but it also provides for the business to also potentially bring in another partner to share the load to then return it to profitability. So the outcome of financial distress is awareness, and awareness of what's gone on and what they need to do to actually succeed into the future.
How common is it that scenario where they're in this situation and they find a new partner to bring into the business that's going to help turn things around? Is that a common occurrence or is that rare?
We're finding it more common at the moment, given that we're sort of coming into a bit of a generational change within business. There are a lot of older generational business owners that are looking at their younger staff, middle management coming up and through the business. And the business owners are looking for some succession, and therefore they have to be looking at who is coming up and through the organisation who can take the lead to enable them to, for want of a better term, retire.
Yeah.
So what we're finding, as I said, with that generational change, finding that baby boomers are now getting to that age where they're looking to retire, and they're actually looking, what is going on with my business, and am I maximizing profitability? And if I'm not, what do I need to do to maximize my exit? So what you often find is that where a business has gone through an adverse financial situation, those business owners become more focused on that, which is a positive that can come out of the position they're in.
And what about, the whole area of mergers and acquisitions? And is that, are businesses that are in this kind of financial stress, they're looking at a restructure, is it viable pickings for other businesses to come along and say, right, we can see an opportunity here?
Yes, it can be. Strategic acquisitions would be more so where it's at. If there is a business out there which is generating sufficient sales, but with its current staffing level is not profitable, and then you have a key competitor who could quite easily absorb the staffing costs because they have capacity within their own business to do so, and maybe at a small additional cost, obtain the revenue that comes with that. Certainly their strategic acquisition on behalf of the competitor. So yes, they can too be an outcome of the process.
I'm intrigued as well when you're going through this kind of process. Does it immediately send alarm bells out about that particular business in a way that isn't helpful in that kind of situation to maximize the sale price or merger price or whatever it might be? Does the minute that we start talking about these kinds of things just trigger too many alarm bells for people?
Look, by its very nature, insolvency is not nice. It does and can trigger alarm bells. However, I think the people that work in the various industries. The economy is more sophisticated these days. And those that, for want of a better term, cashed up, they will be looking out for opportunities and opportunities to acquire. So on the one hand, there is a negative connotation that goes with insolvency. But on the other hand, the positive outcomes that can come from that for the right party generally outweigh the negative.
Talk to me a little bit about voluntary administration as well, because that is another alternative to the liquidation path.
So voluntary administration is a regime that came back into force in 1993, shortly after I came in the industry. So it's been around for a long time, as have I. And
So you weren't responsible for bringing it back, though.
no, I wasn't responsible for bringing it in. But the beauty about a voluntary administration is that through a deed of company arrangement, again, a company can provide a return to its creditors that would be greater than, say, a liquidation scenario. That's one of the purposes of a voluntary administration. The other purpose of a voluntary administration is to enable the company to continue to trade. So that being said, the difference between voluntary administration and small business restructure, however, is that with a small business restructure, it is, for want of a better term, a debtor in possession. The directors are still in control of the business on a day-to-day trading, whilst the small business restructure is going through its plan phase and going through the entire phase. However, with a voluntary administration, once an insolvency practitioner is appointed as the administrator, they are actually in control and responsible for the operation of the company. And what also comes with that is everything to do with the risk of running that company. So as an insolvency practitioner, being appointed as voluntary administrator, generally I'm personally liable for all the debts incurred from that point forward throughout the period with which the voluntary administration continues.
I mean, that's a difficult situation to be in, isn't it? Because you're going into a business that you don't necessarily know the business.
Correct. So quite quickly, we need to come up to speed with the business, come up to speed with its financial position, do some very quick forecasting to ensure that we're able to trade the business at worst break even. Or even if we operate at a small loss, because it may be worthwhile operating at a small loss to at least get the business sold as a going concern, which will provide a greater return than breaking it up and selling the assets piecemeal. So it can get very hectic in a very short space of time, but this is what we're educated to do.
Is that a position that you enjoy being in, if that's the right term? Because taking on that kind of personal liability is a huge thing to be able to do. So how easy is it just for you personally to make that decision to take that on?
Look, everything that we do is calculated. We have our systems and processes in place to enable us to determine whether or not we can operate this business profitably. And it's part and parcel of attempting to get the best return to creditors than the other scenario, which is liquidation, worst case return. Been doing it for 35 years, it sort of comes of second nature now. If we're unable to trade the business profitably, well, then it's highly unlikely that the business owners will be able to continue to trade it profitably into the future. Therefore, any deed of company arrangement proposal is unlikely to be successful. So it's an extra level, in my view, of due diligence as to the ability of the business to be able to trade into the future profitably, because if the insolvency practitioner is unable to do it during the 35 days of their appointment, then it's highly unlikely that the business will be able to do that in the future.
I mean, it's quite a short period of time, really, to have to turn things around.
It is. It is a short period of time. However, that can be extended in various different circumstances. But at the end of the day, the idea is also not for the practitioner to be there for too long, because that also adds to cost. And sometimes the cost of the process may be the very reason why it's unable to succeed in a deed of company arrangement. So there is a fine line there that we need to be operating on to ensure that there is the best return and best outcome for the company and the best return for creditors.
I imagine you also have to know your own limitations when you go into that scenario. I mean, your background's in accounting and there are many facets to a business. The financial side is one part, but there are the ins and outs of different businesses, but there's the marketing, there's the sales, there's lots of bits and pieces and components that make it up. How important is it to be on top of all of those elements very quickly and know what's working, what's not, what needs to go, where you might need to make personnel changes? Does all that happen in relatively quickly in that space? And do you have to have good people around you because it's not to be able to advise you on those different elements?
Yeah, look, generally those sorts of things happen within the first 7 to 10 days leading up to the first meeting of creditors. So then you can explain to creditors, what you've done and what direction the business is going in and why. And that is the key because, creditors are all keen to understand the why. And so that's certainly an important aspect. So in regard to determining, who should stay, who should go, that'll be determined by the analysis of, the staffing levels, their capacity, the nature of the business, what staffing levels are required in what areas, so on and so forth. And it also comes down to, industry experience as well. I tend to do a lot of work in the construction industry around construction contracts, around completion. Quite often have gone in and completed construction contracts during the period of time. And you get to know what can be done, what can't be done, and whether certain projects can be completed or whether there's no chance of them being completed at all. And it all depends on the ability for everyone to work together, the administrators and their staff with the current management and their staff and the creditors, because to be successful, the creditors need to be on board. If we're operating on a project and despite creditors being owed money up until the date of my appointment, without those particular creditors to assist in finishing a project, the project won't be finished. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done by all parties pulling together to get a successful outcome.
Well, that's it for this episode of the IO Insolvency Options podcast. I hope you've got plenty of valuable knowledge and practical steps for whatever your situation is from Darren today. And if you need guidance on insolvency matters, contact Darren Vardy directly at insolvencyoptions.com.au or call 1800 463 328. Or of course, you can connect with Darren on LinkedIn. Details in the show notes below. With over 30 years of experience, Darren and his team provide personalised solutions for both personal and corporate insolvency challenges. This episode was produced by my team at podcastdoneforyou.com.au, helping professionals share their expertise through powerful podcast content. If you found value in today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe to the IO Insolvency Options podcast wherever you are listening to this. Your engagement helps us reach more business owners who need these crucial insights. Until next time, remember, there's always a way forward when you know your options.